Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name is Aaron and this is MindScience episode 11. In today's video, I want to clear up a big issue that I keep coming across in the self-love community, and that is this whole notion that you need to befriend your ego or have a healthy relationship with it. Now, I'm well aware of the fact that people who say this are totally well-meaning and have no idea that they're actually walking people straight into the lion's mouth when they say this. But this is exactly why we need to be careful what things we teach others in spirituality. Because if you're teaching something that hasn't come from first-hand direct experience, then you're only teaching from an assumption. And that's exactly what this teaching is. This is a misconception that really has the power to put people in a state of deep confusion and suffering. Because the truth is, any attention or acknowledgement you give the ego, positive or negative, is equally empowering it to life. And in my experience, there's only one chief argument these people use to justify this idea of befriending your ego. And that is, look, everyone in spirituality says that you need to fight and suppress your ego. But that's the totally wrong approach, man. You can't get rid of your ego. That's impossible. The Buddha was lying. All you can do is develop a healthy relationship with it. Okay, so first of all, no. Nobody anywhere with any semblance of a platform teaches that you need to fight and suppress your ego. This is nothing more than a straw man argument. And if you're one of those people who say that there are, then please comment below with the names of these spiritual teachers. Secondly, I've seen firsthand the level of spiritual narcissism that this belief can lead to. And as the old saying goes, you always know a tree by its fruit. What these people really mean when they say this is that they hear spiritual teachers like Eckhart Tolle talk about transcending the ego. And because they don't understand what that actually means, they assume the teacher is saying that you need to have a WWE smackdown with your ego and beat it into submission, which they correctly decipher is obviously the wrong approach. But the problem is they then swing to the opposite polarity and say, well then the solution is you need to wine and dine your ego into submission. This is just another crafty way that the ego preserves itself from being seen for what it is. The people who say this don't realize that they're actually still speaking from the ego. The ego wants you to either love it or hate it, but it cannot compute the idea of its own unreality. The ego can never have the realization, oh, I get it, I'm not real. So if you feel any mental resistance towards this idea of transcending your ego, then you can be sure that that's the ego resisting its own death. The world of duality is the ego's playground, and so the positive approach will strengthen the ego just as much as the negative approach. You can't become friends with a software program. You can't develop a healthy relationship with a robot. And so the same result will happen from the positive or the negative approach, which is a more powerful ego that can exert even more control over you and lead to even more suffering. So in today's video, I'm going to show you why you can't befriend the ego and what the correct approach actually is. The unfortunate truth is that there's a lot of misguided ideas that get passed around in the spiritual community, because everyone is in a rush to form their own conclusions and very slow to actually listen to true masters like Eckhart Tolle, Ramana Maharshi, or Nisargadatta. I've actually seen self-proclaimed self-love gurus say that the only true form of self-love is ego love. Your ego is your sense of self. It's what makes you, you. Therefore, ego and self-love are the exact same thing. These self-love experts almost always go on to recommend that you should write out a list of 100 things you love about yourself. And of course they're well-meaning when they say this, but please, do not write out a list of 100 things you love about yourself. That's not self-love, that's insecurity trying to convince itself otherwise. When the ego sees you doing this, it is licking its chops. Why? Because the ego's entire belief system is the idea that your value depends on what you do. It's the part of your mind that is literally designed to pick you apart. So all you're actually doing is writing out a list of 100 ways the ego can attack you. So let me save you some time by showing you how this practice will go. Number 1, I love myself because I'm such a good mother to my children. Oh, how sweet. But what about all those times you get angry and yell at them at the grocery store? That's not very good now, is it? Well, no, but I'm just a human and everyone makes mistakes. And sometimes when you're tired, you secretly wish you could take a vacation away from them, don't you? Sometimes I just get tired and want a little break, okay? And you also used to spank your children when they were younger, didn't you? You know that's a form of abuse, right? Well, I was just doing the best I could at the time, okay? I didn't know any better back then. Yeah, but you said that you love yourself because you're a good mom, but you've hit your children, you scream at them in public, and you want to take a vacation away from them. I don't know, I'm just doing my best, okay? Well, I actually think you could do a lot better, don't you? Yeah, I probably could. You should probably be a lot more like your friend Janet. Everyone thinks that Janet's the perfect mom. Even your own kids love Janet. I know, and I fucking hate her for it. Yeah, but deep down you know she's better than you. All right, so what's the next item on the list? I love myself because I'm such a good wife. Ooh, excellent. So, good luck loving yourself if you think that your value depends upon what you do. Now, some of you are probably wondering, why does the ego relate to us in this way? Did the universe make a mistake or something? And I have an entire video that goes into great detail on what the ego is, how it was created, and what its function is, which you can watch here if you'd like a more comprehensive breakdown. But for now, I'll just summarize by saying this. The ego is a product of natural selection. It is a modulation of our biology's fight or flight system that was put in place once humans became self-aware and started creating more intricate social systems within our group dynamic. A part of our brain needed to evolve to keep up with this new development, and so the ego became much more complex and intelligent to help us survive not just physically, but socially. This is why our fight or flight response is almost exclusively triggered by human interactions and social situations. As ancient humans began forming tribes, the status in the social hierarchy became another important variable in the ego's list of survival. If your status in the social hierarchy dropped, then you'd have much more trouble finding a good mate, and you might even have a harder time accessing food and shelter. And if you drop far enough down the social ladder, you'd be kicked out of the tribe entirely. The ego is the part of your mind that nature has designed to ensure that this won't happen. So if someone attacks me, I better attack them back. If I make a mistake, then the ego better make me feel so awful about that mistake that I'll never do it again. Everything in the ego's world revolves around survival. It knows nothing of peace, love, or acceptance. So although the ego is the cause of all your suffering, it is not evil by any means. From its perspective, it's just trying to help you survive. The ego is inherently neutral. So the ego has learned how to use the body's emotional fight or flight response to its advantage. If we wanted to oversimplify the ego, we could say that it is a psychological machine that only produces thoughts of guilt. Guilt is the mechanism the ego has created to trigger the body's fight or flight response. When the ego tells us that someone else is guilty, it triggers fight, which is anger. When it tells us that we are guilty, it triggers flight, which is fear. And the ego can only relate to you on this basis and in no other way. It can only tell you that you're lacking something, that you are incomplete, and that other people are the source of all your problems. It is only capable of self-preservation thinking. So if any undesired outcome manifests, then either you are guilty or someone else is guilty. And this is how the ego motivates you to look out for number one and to continually seek to improve yourself. So someone who says they've developed a healthy relationship with their ego is like somebody standing next to a robot and saying, "Hey guys, I want to introduce you to my new best friend, Ego."
You are guilty.
Oh, Ego, you're so funny. Hey, what do you think about my friends?
They are guilty.
Oh, Ego, you're the best.
You are guilty.
So don't get it twisted. It is not your friend or your enemy. The ego doesn't exist. The ego is not your sense of self. It is your false sense of self. All that's happening is some thoughts are being constantly created by the mind, always changing all the time, and they're being given an identity as if they were an entity. And so someone who doesn't understand what their ego is might say, see, you can't live without this sense of self over here, so stop trying to get rid of it because it's impossible. And that's correct. You can't get rid of it because it isn't actually there. There is no entity which is responsible for all the bad things you think. You are no more the thinker of thoughts than the digester of food or the beater of your heart. If you were responsible for beating your heart, then you could also stop it at any moment, couldn't you? And this is exactly why you can't stop the ego from thinking, because you didn't start it either. All you need to see is that you are not responsible for what the ego thinks. Thoughts are just another bodily system that you've inherited, which are running autonomously. You are not the thinker of thoughts. And, of course you aren't. What could be more obvious than this? If it was really up to you, you would never think a single thought which causes suffering. You would always think thoughts that make you happy and at peace. So the question is, who is thinking the thoughts that you aren't good enough, that you're guilty and incomplete? The answer is nobody. All you need to do is see that you are not guilty for the ego's thoughts. This is where true freedom lies. The eyes of awareness, if left alone, perceive correctly. But when we are identified with the voice of the ego, awareness looks at the world through the ego's eyes and misperceives. It then sees a guilty world full of lack and fear. I'll tell you a personal story to help drive this point home. When I was 5 or 6 years old, my family had a white Ford van that we would use to travel around the country in when my parents were traveling ministers. It was the first van that had a TV in it, and the back seats would actually lay down so my sister and I could watch Rugrats and fall asleep while my parents drove through the night. My sister and I loved that van so much that we actually named it Michael. We talked about Michael like he was our best friend and our third sibling. And the day finally came when my parents had to sell Michael, and when my sister and I found out, we were devastated. We sobbed and cried and said, "How could you have done this? Michael was our best friend. He took us on every road trip we ever went on. We'll never forgive you for this." Both of us suffered for years over the loss of Michael. And it wasn't until many years later when I was old enough to finally see that Michael never existed. It was always just a bunch of metal and electrical machinery that I imagined was a real entity. And so all of my suffering was essentially an illusion. And so I never had a real relationship with Michael, and he was never my friend. And once I realized this, all my suffering was gone. So this is the nature of your ego. It is being imagined, and you are suffering at its hands for no real reason. The ego doesn't actually exist in the same way that Siri doesn't exist, or Alexa doesn't exist. There is nobody actually there. It is a cleverly designed program that you take to be real when you overlook its true nature. So if there were any spiritual teachers out there saying you should fight your ego away, which there aren't, they would be wrong. But likewise, anyone saying you should become best buddies with your ego is also wrong. You cannot fight or befriend something that isn't real. It's just a mechanical part of your mind that is designed to relate to you on one singular basis, which is the belief, I am incomplete. This is the ego's mission statement, and everything it says to you is just a variation of this one belief. So in this way, the ego is an effect, not a cause. The cause of the ego effect is the belief, I am incomplete. But remove the belief, and the ego vanishes from reality. This is the only obstacle in self-realization. You think the ego actually exists, and you do not know that every thought, feeling, and experience you have is but a momentary appearance which is happening inside of you. So the only relationship you can have with it is to see its unreality. Like the little child from the Matrix says, "Don't try and bend the spoon, that's impossible. Only seek to realize the truth, there is no spoon. In the same way, don't try to get rid of your ego, only seek to realize that there is no ego. And this is what the Course in Miracles means when it says, enlightenment does not wake you up from the dream, it merely shows you who the dreamer is. So as long as you believe that you are your ego, it is impossible to love yourself, because the ego is the part of your mind that is literally designed to pick you apart. It is built to live by comparisons and find you lacking. It has no other function. And so if you don't love yourself, that's simply a sign that you have known yourself wrongly. You must believe that you are your thoughts, your personal history, your insecurities, or your physical appearance. All you need to see is that you are not anything that changes, that your value is eternal and is never defined by what you do. You are the source of everything that you want, which means that only what you have not given can ever be lacking. And so the paradox of enlightenment is to give to yourself everything you believed that the world was denying you, to overlook illusions of what you are not, and that what you seek is what you have always been all along.